Hello everyone, today we talk about cohortal tactics in the 1st century BC. So essentially we will take a look to the few things we actually know about the cohorts in battle in the 1st century of their existence, from the Marian Reform to the Augustan age. And at some point we will make a video explaining specifically how few we actually know about the cohortal array per se, right? And especially concerning a topic that is of relative importance actually, but that kind of strikes a bit mechanistically the interest of many people. That is to say, did the Roman legion have a continuous front line, or were there gaps, and how large were they, and how much did the legion occupy in surface and in front line, and all this stuff? Well, the simple answer to this is that nobody knows, meaning that we can rely, as we will see, on a very few information. And one part of the scholarship essentially came up with the idea that the cohortal line had a continuous line in the front, there were no gaps, instead that the manipular one had. Another part of the scholarship says completely the opposite, and therefore it's just an hypothesis. We simply don't know. These things are important in the sense that if we knew them, and if we knew other things about the Roman legion, we could try to objectively explain certain things. But the problem is we don't even know how this thing worked, right? In basic things like, I don't know, we don't even know how much space there was among every legionnaire. We rely just on what Polybius and Vegetsus say. That they're the only sources in Roman history that say, respectively, that the Roman army basically had an open order and a closed, almost a phalangitic order. If you calculate the respective measures, even Polybius' passage is, subject to interpretation, because we don't even know exactly which feet in distance is referring to. That makes a big difference, because even counting the lowest estimate by Polybius, a legion arrayed with an open order would occupy at least 66% more than one in close order. We don't know how much gap was there among the maniples. We don't know how maniple swapping actually happened. That's another thing that people presume to know sometimes. We don't really know. There is no way to know. There are certain hypotheses that are better than others. At some point we can make a video on that, actually, to explain how, the most ergonomic way they could swap maniples. Consider that in this period, the maniples keep existing within the cohort, right? Actually, the cohort is born out properly of the manipular system, in the sense that originally, the 1/10 of the 3 maniples in depth of the legion, one maniple of Astati, one of Principes, and another of Triari, was with a relative veritas at that point that disappeared. Last mention is by the Numidian War, so we are already arrived in Marian times, were supplied together, right? So yet another video should be dedicated to the origin of the cohortal system, like why it was born. Many people say it was because the Romans had to cope with the Germanic cunes. Well, the first first cohorts are actually witnessed 1 century before that. So, and actually facing, however, enemies that relied a little bit also on this shock charges sometimes, but for the rest were mostly guerrilla, and has mostly to do with Celtiberian Spain, where the sources actually talk specifically about cohorts on multiple occasions, like Livy, for example, telling in parallel 2nd century BC Roman history talks, so before the Marian Reform, namely, talks about cohorts 17 times for the Spanish theater, and only of maniples for the Greek one, the Macedonian. So this is also quite fascinating, because more than a tactical reason, it was a political, a social, and a strategical one, right? If you know what the Marian reform concretely consisted in, basically had nothing strictly military, right? The military just adapted fundamentally to this political reform to allow enlistment from the capitacensi, the proletari that were in need because of the Numidian War, where the Romans had, basically no interest to engulf themselves in, and Marius just did the thing for the sake of political prestige against Metellus and political rivalry and all this stuff. You know how the story went. But the Marian reform properly in itself didn't change, or better to say, didn't invent anything new. Right, it was just putting together stuff that was being done fundamentally since 1 century, at least in practice. Even armament, all this stuff, it's just a notion. It's just a historiographical tradition that attributes to Marius certain things, but we don't have to think that they actually changed, the shape of the shield so that they wouldn't bang on the knees or stuff like that. I mean, those are things that changed by themselves throughout a longer time. The same pay is something that existed since the time of Veii, right? Less regularly, but still not. So there is sometimes a lot of misunderstanding about this period, because objectively, we by a certain point of view, we know less about the cohort than the maniple, the manipular legion, because the cohort eventually lived on, and until essentially the 3rd century. You have at that point 400 years of use of the cohort. The maniple lasted, at least as a manipular legion proper, as from basically the 4th century BC to, in fact, it was fully surpassed by the time of the Marian reform. But the cohort in itself, it's not much like, you see. The point is the following, that we focus pretty much just on tactics, right? Because people play video games and they just think that it's a matter of how eventually these troops fight, how they act in combat, and they tend to start to answer only from that standpoint. Actually, the cohort was, as we've seen, the consequence of a political and social change, surely of Roman society, surely within the wake of an important military tradition. But it was primarily dictated by, in fact, this, political reason of needing professionals, full-time professionals in great numbers to, at that point it would be basically trained and equipped by the state with a certain degree of uniformity throughout all the service, would be properly fighting for land, not because they had land and had to fight like it was before. So all the beginning of the period of what Anglo-Saxon historiography calls, not quite badly, the one of Roman warlords, like, the crisis of the Republic and all that stuff. But banally, the cohort is also important at the strategical level for allowing a more consistent detachment in certain areas that were more difficult to control, such like Spain, so that you can have an important bulk of troops that you can detach, and that's kind of strategically and tactically autonomous and complete, right? And you can spread over a territory that is difficult to control and all this stuff. So it's an important set of causes that shouldn't make us think it's just, we have to sort out how this thing was tactically new, right? We have to understand how it was, in the sense that, for example, an army of full professionals is surely different from one of, part-time militia, and things even in here had changed since an important amount of time. Already by the 3rd century BC, the Roman army was fundamentally like that, even if formally we think it wasn't until the Marian reform. Even there we fixate too much. So all things we cannot discuss today, but they are kind of fundamental. Like, if you don't pass from those, it's useless even to be talking about tactics. So that's why I felt the need to make this introduction. So the cohort, as we will see, had certain advantages that had brought it into use, and that had to do mostly also with simply the different extraction of the troops, their level of training, their full professionalization that brings these armies to be capable of doing things that the same Romans hadn't been, completely capable of doing before on a regular base. right? And also that other peoples fundamentally had never seen, just, certain levels of professionalism, maybe the Macedonian phalanx. But just to make a point, in many cases, the simple appearance of the Roman legions arrayed for battle was satisfactory to disperse the enemy, right? This happened sometimes to Caesar. That is also, the source that today we will obviously quote the most, because it's the most, the commentari are simply the largest, actually, amount of military news per single author that we get, and especially if you're for the 1st century BC Roman history, when, for example, in the Bello Gallicus 8:29, he says, and thus suddenly the legions appeared, and in tight order, right? The expression in Latin is confertus. Great agitation spread in the barbarian cavalry. The terror among the deployed infantry, confusion and fright in the column of supplies, and therefore high noise, cry rose, and running desperately, all the enemy put themselves into flight. So the cohorts could be deployed on a single line, such as it happened at Ruspi 946 BC. We know it from the Bellum Africum 13. In the case such as that one, in which it had been necessary to cover a very wide front. The term in the Bellum Africum 13 is acius simplex, so properly single, the simple line, meant as a single one. That is to say, you have just one, and that's in a certain sense what I would like to stress here is that, as we will see also better, the cohortal legion was often deployed on multiple lines, 2 or 3, right? So this is something that you find in many other armies in military history on a regular base, right? So even in here, the Romans resorting to, for example, for reasons such as widening the front to a single line, right? It's kind of obvious because of that tactical contingency, but it's still meaningful for 2 reasons. Because first of all, the Roman legion, the manipular one, had been evolving from the so-called phalanx that wasn't actually much of a phalanx as we mean it in the Hellenic sense, still in that Italic context, was created exactly to increase the depth of the formation and the gradual effort, and the flexibility with the reserves, right? So that if you break one single acius, you have other 2, right? With the triplex acius, in fact, that can fight. There are advantages and disadvantages of that. The second is that in as we'll see also better later with Flavius Josephus, the cohortal legion could rely on much more individually disciplined and drilled troops, right? That could thin the line, sometimes exactly to widen the front, and still being an imposing obstacle to pass for the enemy. But the most practiced deployment was indeed the one on 2 lines, the duplex acius. It was a solution which allowed a much more flexible management of battle, especially in the very frequent case of numerical inferiority. Think about the Gallic Wars. In fact, you can quote, for example, the Bello Gallico 3:24, when Caesar explicitly talks about duplex acius. I don't know why sometimes people believe that the Romans had their strength in the fact that they were numerically superior, that they confuse, the tactical from the political, social, strategical level. That is to say, yes, the Romans had dramatic resources, especially at this time in Italy and in the colonized provinces, but in terms of manpower, but tactically speaking, that doesn't mean that there were kind of tons of legions sent against numerically inferior enemies that kind of took him out. The Romans were on a. I mean, the Gallic Wars are basically the I think the easiest example of that, right? And given that is often mentioned, especially in front of the barbarians, because they want to stress the fact that individually they were stronger, but that is completely jumping the fact that collectively the Romans were stronger. It is to say, you could have indeed much greater individual training of which is also debatable on a certain level, because the average, I don't know, Celtic warrior was just, especially in Gaul, like a guy that didn't see actually much warfare on its own. He was kind of basically summoned up by these feudal landlords that kind of oppressed him and brought him to into a formation that had to hold for some time, so relying mostly on mass and nothing else. An individual, a more aristocratic Celtic warrior definitely had a higher individual training and capacity than a Roman legionary, however, was still a professional. And battles are not won by the strength or capability of the single individual, but by formations of in fact, in this case of cohortal size. I mean, if you look at how battles worked, it's because one massive chunk of the formation, I don't know, collapsed on one flank, and then, those guys, the enemies that were in front were able to outflank you, and then it did crumble. Right? Most of the deal was like this. Other times, yes, it's mostly about a frontal resistance, etc., but at the end of the day, there is always a collapse in one section, and the thing is taken advantage by a large formation. Individual soldiers here are sometimes praised for bravery, for resilience, and all this stuff. But the Romans actually are the favored in these accounts. But that's where it ends, right? There is properly a tactical development of battles that if you don't get acquainted properly from the sources, and this is what I will exhaust myself, by repeating it ad nauseam all the time, there is no speculation that holds, right? And I personally detest how popular culture is based 90% on speculation. That is to say, have you even read these sources? Because you see, there are not even many. Like, when you talk about ancient warfare, you don't have to make this dramatic effort. It's not easy. You should know the original language. You should be very careful about what is written there, and we will try to observe something today also about that. But fundamentally, you have to enter in the mindset that if you don't study these battles serially and properly being able to make a comparison, reasoning by analogy with all due cautions, but still, having an idea of the scale of the difference, right? And you insist on individuality, it's because you have never truly read this stuff, and there's no way around it. So here, the deal is obvious. Like, you need a second line so that you can hold the mass of the enemy with the first, and then tiring them down. So we've studied in von Clausewitz how all that proceeds when you exhaust essentially an enemy that commits himself entirely into battle. So maybe your first line is overwhelmed, but the second is fresh, and it doesn't matter how small it is. But if the enemy is spent, let's say it's done for, you can overrun them. Naturally, it's never so simple, meaning that the odds are much more balanced. But still, the cohort, as we will see, could also maneuver in a way that could cover with through the reserves, outflanking maneuvers, holding the line in a much more flexible way, and the disposition of the single hordes in battle array within the same legion is described with a certain detail by Vegetius 2:7. And naturally, we are in the 5th century AD. Presumably, yes, on the base of information that had been consolidated from centuries at that point, but still too old to be completely reliable. Vegetius, sometimes we have difficulty even to understand sometimes where he got his information for his historical work. He admittedly by himself wasn't much of a military competent person, and also was trying a bit to idealize the past and also, rendering it kind of more coherent in a certain sense. But here, that's why we need to make those videos about what are the historical problems of reconstruction, properly the reliability of that information, right? But there is a logic in here. We know through him the cohorts were deployed on two lines in function of value and of experience. This is true in any formation. Like, you don't have a fully homogeneous reality for which within, a certain contubernum, a certain century, a certain maniple, a certain cohort, a certain legion, you have, soldiers that are all the same, right? Formations specifically have, in fact, a form, an order, a different width compared to the depth. You have troops that are, individual soldiers that are deployed with a certain order to form certain specific ranks and to provide properly a certain characteristics, a certain direction of the unit, right? You can't simply change front and pretending that a unit works the same way, right? Aside from the fact that it does need space to do that, but it's properly, soldiers are trained to fight having one guy in front of them, and that specific guy, like not another one. And still, they all rely on each other in that point. There are very strong bonds. Now we'll also talk about them. So goes for the cohorts. They're not all the same. Vegetsis says that the first on the right and the third on the center and the fifth on the left, right? That is the positions rightfully deemed as the most delicate in the array were the best cohorts, right? In the second line, so in the first line, in the second line, the same critical positions were held respectively by the 6th, by the 8th, and by the 10th cohort. This is according to Vegetsis. So in short, you have 5 cohorts in the front, 5 in the rear, and the most important ones in each line are respectively the ones in the center, right, and the ones on the corners. This is important because it's a bit like, and the first cohort, right, the strongest is upright, right, just like centurions were within the centuries themselves, and the first centurion of the cohort, in fact, in the front right position. Roman battle arrays, differently from the Greek ones, were symmetric, right? The Greeks had a stronger right, and this followed because they were much more concentrated on the problem of the shield and of the alignment for reasons now we can't digress on. The Romans instead had a frontal idea of war, like properly warriors and this other, fundamentally Central European population. They had a symmetric deployment, right? Because they were all about the frontal attack and one-to-one in the face of the enemy. But still, of course, the idea that because of the shield needs, the formation would gradually shift to the right just for feeling yourself protected, kind of trying to cover a bit more your uncovered right flank, is needed the strongest elements of the army, of the formations, to be deployed on the right, right? So that's what centurions did, and this is particularly important. They weren't the only ones, and conversely, this practice exemplified by Vegetsis lets us, believe that the other cohorts were usually considered less valid and reliable, right? So the ones that fundamentally were framed actually between the others, the strongest ones laterally, right? This is important, but also we shouldn't think that it was kind of always in the same way, because this, of course, has a meaning and an importance, but still there would be tactical contingencies in which you would need, maybe all the strongest cohorts on the first line, right, in the weaker in the rear. Well, this is just a but here we are entering the field of speculation just this might have been a very important aspect of also how these cohorts were collectively trained, right? What the sheer practice of learning could be more beneficial for certain elements located in certain areas, depending on the situation. But also we know a few about standard training, how that was carried out. Naturally, the cohortal and legionary deployment in the critical points depended on the scale of the internal values established by the commander. For example, Caesar at Pharsalus deployed on the right the loyal 10th Legion, and on the left the veteran 8th and 9th Legions. This is from the Civil War 389. And so there was also a triplex acies, 3 battle lines. An array often practiced by Caesar, right, with the first line formed by 4 cohorts and the other 2 by 3. This is a compromise that unites, a large enough, a broad enough front and, a consistent amount of reserves, but also, an important depth that can allow moving other elements also to counter outflanking maneuvers and so on. In fact, especially the cohorts deployed in the third line had a tactical function of reserve, right? Because the second line would be mostly always, be ready in support of the first. But the third one had the purpose of reinforcing naturally itself, the battle line, wherever it had the necessity had presented itself, such as it happened, for example, against Ariovistus, against the Germans, and that line, definitely like the Germans had very very strong anvil units, right? They had a greater resilience on the field than, I don't know, say the Celts that counted paradoxically on a more regular base on the en masse charge. Like the Germans were famous themselves for the Cuneius formation they used, but still they had mostly this capacity of maintaining the line back and forth and kind of being resilient, hitting hits, maintaining, being able to retreat kind of safely. So this speaks for also the difficulty of the Roman hammer in the aggressive mindedness of the legion, actually also too. In fact, we will see it better later, and especially with the professionalization of the Roman army, right? This is where the Roman legionnaire had an extremely aggressive mindset, contrarily wise to what is commonly believed, that it's the idea just the ones who take, right? No, there was a specific emphasis placed properly on the attack, on this, and on the concerted, in fact, effort to break the enemy lines before even with the pila volleys and the answering charge. The same reinforcement by cohorts of the third line is used by Caesar at Pharsalus, so against Pompey. This is the first example of Ariovistus is the Gallic War 152. The one of Pharsalus is the Civil War 394. And the third line could also help to sustain new fronts, right? So literally, from flank attack. So for example, how it happened at the Battle of Bibracte against the Helvetians in Gallic War 125, where the cohorts of the third line were used to cope with a sudden flank attack. This speaks naturally for the flexibility of this infantry. I mean, this is stuff that they did even in the Middle Ages, when we don't know. I don't know, look at the battle, the maneuvers before the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. We know the Italian communes did this often. So these are tactics that normally, an enough drilled infantry can't do. Here we're talking about the greatest military professionals of the ancient world. So we shouldn't say, oh, wow, because it's the Roman military machine. It's something that, that goes the quality of the Roman army goes much deeper than that. These are maneuvers that also at a cohortal level, so we're talking about, the cohort at this point for 480 men, more or less, because that also floated. Really, they weren't all alike, especially during the civil wars. Everybody knows that these units were dramatically depleted and under strength, but still, in fact, they were grouped on that occasion. But we will talk about this in a completely different video, because today we need to make just a bit of clarity overall. But that's kind of a number, a size, a unit size that allows you to do not acrobacies on the field. You just need that bulky, multiple hundred legionnaires unit to be able to move quick one direction or another to cope with this threat. Right? This is very important. And the triplex Achaeus was in reality a indispensable tactical necessity in order to cope with enemies that were usually numerically superior, as we have already seen, and to cope with possible outflanking maneuvers. In some case, Caesar came to form even a fourth line in order to surprise part of Pompey's cavalry. Famously enough, this is from the Civil War 389, but that was more like coping for the enemy outflanking a single, it wasn't properly aligned. It was just a certain amount of troops located on the flank, but still, right, that's still in depth another line, ideal. So, many scholars, since Delbrück, Domaszewski, Kepi, etc., have attempted to reconstruct the tactical deployment of a cohort in battle, and especially the employment of the centuries that made them up. So the information obtainable from literary sources of the time are also in this case very fragmentary and actually devoid of details, right? If they base themselves fundamentally just on Caesar's works and on a few other traceable hints in works of subsequent periods. And it's, however, been hypothesized that the deployment of these subunits was decided case by case by the older Centurion of the first maniple, in function of the experience of the troops, of the threat to cope with, and other available forces. For example, with the 6 centuries posed on 2 lines, or with the priores centuries, so the advanced ones in first line and the posteriores in the second, and with the maniple of the triarii presumably deployed on the right. This is just hypothesis. As you understand here, yes, maniples were still a thing. They would remain also in imperial times, notoriously. The centuries as well, we find their relics basically also in the late Roman army. Why? Well, because of course the centuries, as you know, 1 maniple is 2 centuries, 1 cohort is 3 centuries, in depth, ideally. But as we've seen, they could be deployed also differently in this regard, and that's where things change a little bit from the manipular system, right? Because since the Second Punic War, we have seen also the Battle of Ilipa, and we will see also in others the Battle of the Great Plains or the same Zama, right? The deal was to even properly detach all the Astati line from the Principes line to make the latter, making the encircling maneuvers, right? So the concept that fundamentally the maniple, let's say the formation in depth was kind of less important than the one in line, sometimes was already understood in a sense. It's a bit as if Scipio had already operated with these, in fact, cohorts, as the same sources actually, speak of in sometimes different ways. Sometimes we have the Semaya, also because these are also Greek authors that talk about that. There is probably the transliteration in Greek of Cohortis, if I'm not wrong, from Polybius once, but the other on another occasion. Also, Greek sources sometimes from Polybius uses spadae for maniples, but later Greek sources speak of spadae for cohorts, so you have to be careful about such things. But all in all, the idea that the subunits of a cohort could be, let's say, changed in position within the same cohort is plausible, and at that point there was the higher NCO in command, so the Centurion of the first cohort, the first century, the first maniple, but would take in charge the situation. Also, he was the commander, right, deployed in the front line, so he was the one that was properly in charge what was going on, could appreciate the differences, and also because he had the greater experience, and so on. So all this entails, in terms of spaces of maneuvers, enough room, right? And that's where we properly have no clue how this thing works, right? Because, for example, if you have to make a maniple turn, as we've seen before, it doesn't work as simply as changing front, right? You need to make it do actually a simple maneuver, but it has to have enough time, right? Enough space, excuse me, that is to be at least as much as the maniple's depth at that point to make it work. So in here, we are not properly, we are in the field of pure speculation, right? Some authors, of course, it's plausible that these units and subunits would open or close their order. And we don't know, however, how the swapping happened, right? Naturally, the idea in here that we get, as we'll see better later, is that the cohort is more, let's say, it's just, first of all, more collectively trained, because it's made up of full professionals now, so they can do more stuff in terms of maneuvers. The problem, though, is that this alleged greater autonomy of the cohort, which probably existed, had probably to rely also on a specific order, because the column advanced more speedily. And we don't know how they recompacted the line when they eventually engaged. So we don't know whether there are some ways here we will list, either they basically halved the depth by making the half of the line passing to the right, passing onwards on the right of the anterior half, or they properly swapped the sentries inside. So this is a problem that we don't actually have much ways to verify. Surely, though, we know that there is a greater emphasis put in the cohortal legion by deployment in the first ranks of the strongest men, right? Properly, first of all, to deploy the strongest units in the front. It is the best cohorts in the front, and within the same cohorts, the same maniples and sentries, the strongest men, the most mature, the most expert in the front, right? This is particularly evident, for example, by by several references in Caesar's works. Whereas the manipular system worked in a different way, because by definition it had the youngest and the least expert in the front, and then gradually becoming in depth you had the most experienced, the better equipped, and so on. The deployment of the men within the unit in battle was, as we said, tendentially more compact compared to the manipular one, both to oppose more resistance to possible initial impact. So there's more warlike enemies, as we've seen the Celtiberians, the Germans, that tended to bet, let's say, everything on the effect of a unique shock charge, right, after which they were exhausted, both for resist better to the following the subsequent attempts of the enemy to penetrate the array once one section of the line had been broken, right? So you had these reserves in the rear. Albeit the latter is a bit true also for the Manipular Legion, because still the best men within the same maniples. So the various lines that in depth formed the array. So let's assume the maniple of the Astarte is broken. 2 sentries are broken. You have the Principes in the rear, and naturally those are stronger as a line, right? But within the same maniple of Principes, the guys in the front ranks are kind of the best, right? So because they have to withstand the hit. This is pretty standard historically speaking. I mean, battle lines are formed like this since read Xenophon. You need the toughest man to lead, right? And so this naturally was reflected also in the internal deployment of the cohort. They didn't change much, within the same maniples, etc. It's just that the hordes themselves now are usually homogeneous, more homogeneous than what the maniples were in terms of quality, and therefore they can rely more or less, as we've seen also how Vegetsis describes the thing, whether it's actually correct or not, but still it's not much, the quality is not much measured in on the depth, but also on the width of the formation, right? So that is quite meaningful about the level of homogeneity that Marian Reform had brought in terms of the standard training and equipment too, right? These men are all now equipped all the same way. There is no difference anymore. But this was true also probably since the end of the end of the Second Punic War, right? So don't think again that the Marian Reform had done it. By the 2nd century BC, the actual differences in equipment were very low within the same Roman Legion. At least they were lower than properly the previous times, let's say the 3rd century. So, and albeit in theory the depth of the files had to be greater compared to the one of the manipular structure, because as we've seen, banally the cohorts themselves were simply more numerous, right? In manipular times, the century counted 60 men, whereas in Marian times it's 80. So it was just like a more compact formation. But in spite of this, in reality, having the much more expert soldiers available, you could reduce much the depth of the files, sometimes up to 3. At least this is quoting Flavius Josephus, the Jewish War 5:131, which, however, speaks of Titus actually forming a belt of troops around besieged city to prevent a Jewish sortie, right? So it's not properly a pitched battle. So if you find it quoted, just remember it's a bit in a siege warfare context, which is a different thing. But that prevented the enemy from actually selling forth. And 3 ranks are not much at the end of the day. So and instead, while in open field, and especially when you had to cope with a very heavy attack or even a cavalry charge, right? The files had to be much deeper, right? Famously enough, Arrian in his Ectaxis 4 explaining the battle array against the Alans. So basically, the guys had some of the toughest cavalries around. The legionary ranks had to be 8. So files had a depth of 8, and in the case in which you had to dispose of less motivated, less experienced troops, like it happened to Pompey, compared at least to the Caesarian legionnaires at Pharsalus, as Frontinus in this Stratagemata 2.3.22 says, it appeared more advisable to augment further the depth of the columns of the files up to even 10 men. And naturally you have to narrow the front a bit, but in any case it didn't exist a fixed rule. The decision pertained to the commanders in function of the threat to cope with. Always remember, this was very flexible. There is no such thing like a legion identical to the other. Historically speaking, in the history of mankind, an army identical to the other never existed. By any stretch of the imagination, numbers were all different. Could be similar but different. The quality of the troops were different. The equipment, the experience. It all changed. It all floated, right? Consider also in all this that the cohort fought in, the legions fought surrounded by lots of other troops within the same army, right? There were multiple legions, there were auxiliaries, so the more we increase the scale, the focus, the least eventually what you organize troops like from the within is. But you want to optimize it at the same time. Also because this is the city troops. These are full Roman citizens. They are the ones you spend the most for in terms of training, of equipment. They are the ones you have more responsibility for, politically, socially. So they are properly the glory of Rome themselves, and you want them to be the best, right? And that's also part of the reason why they usually, the dirty job was carried out mostly by the auxiliaries. They were expandables who were hungry for citizenship and integration. These guys were sent in instead, usually tactical tasks that were more suited to them, especially close combat, and in situations like especially storming cities, etc., or in a beautiful pitched battle. Well, however, you had already essentially pinned down the bulk of the enemy, and you could simply frontally attack and butcher the hell down. As for the intervals between the troops, there is a huge debate, as we've seen. There are literally completely opposite conclusions to which different scholars arrive regarding the space existing between basically every unit within the Roman legion. So whatever, cohorts, maniples, sentries, right? How much was there? We do not know, right? We don't know. There is no way to know, right? And somebody else maybe quotes things like, for example, there is the Battle of the Sambre against the Belgians. It was a hell of a bloody one. The Romans were about to be defeated, and Caesar, in a moment of difficulty, gave order to open the maniples. The actual verb used in Latin here is laxare, right? Which has the same etymology of relax, right? Lax, meaning to literally to, and this is translated, you see, you can't really translate a language really for this is normally translated in English, I think, like to extend, to open, as if that had to do with the, it's often translated as if they had opened the order, right? Had passed from tight to open order. if you read the passage, it says something different. It says basically that in this massy combat, the Romans had gathered their insignia all in one spot. So that had created confusion because soldiers, Caesar probably says, they were all at that point packed up together, so that they couldn't fight well. So he gives the order to lax the maniples, literally, so that they could fight better with their swords more freely. So this is the Gallic War 225, if I'm not wrong. Well, what this translation means is not exactly that Caesar allowed to open the order, right? The order was open in the sense that he allowed to basically spread out, to fight better individually against the enemy, which is also fascinating because it tells you at that point also the individual combat capabilities of the Roman legion against, quite good infantry like the Belgian one, very, very skilled warriors in hand-to-hand combat. So, and it rather tells to me the fact of the broader disorder that had brought the ensigns to be collected just in one place. What does that mean? Well, the ensign during the fight, renowningly, is the place where you gather around. You have to stick around, right? There is specifically a certain distance you can't go from them. That's your point of reference, right? In the mass, in the chaos. So the fact that you have gathered them all in one point, it means that the relative units are now all kind of messed up. Like there is not properly even a formation anymore, because these units need space by themselves. So this suggests that these guys had recovered there as an emergential measure under the onslaught of their Celtic foes, and they at that point were probably by default not abandoning the ensigns. And Caesar, in the desperate situation, says, okay, if you have to fight at this point, try to push the enemy out away, spread out, right? Don't stick next to the insignia, because at this point the order is so messed up that it doesn't even matter, right? I interpret it like that. This is sometimes interpreted like, you see, this is how the Romans normally opened their order. Well, not quite. Right, not quite, because still, that even in open order, you had to maintain a formation. You had to stick within that perimeter, that extensionally, that surface. You had to maintain a certain distance from the others. Here, it sounds more like, go out there individually and kill those guys without thinking very much of what you have to fight. And that is, considering the various other passages in the same Gallic War where, individual legionnaires do, in fact, pretty individualistic feats, sometimes even to save the rest of the unit. Notoriously, there are many examples, even during the Civil War, mostly, not just centurions, but also other single troopers. Well, that is definitely a possibility also in the fact that, you can imagine how messed up an array would become in battle, right? Men more likely always fight close to others, right? But when it says to maintain a formation in terms of you belong to that century or another, if an entire maybe century is broken, is reformed, regrouped in another place with other units when they are under attack, I mean, that gets blended, right? And so that never forget in that sense the capability of a Roman legionnaire to fight in loose formation, because that's probably one of the single most overlooked aspects of Roman warfare. Then let's say that if we think that maniple swapping happened for each, in fact for the height of each maniple, etc., a few tens of meters would have been enough, right, to eventually make. This probably happened with the shift of the individual sentries mechanically from one side to another, and the posterior lines sentry kicking in, right, and then substituting just like that. But it's just an hypothesis. And this could naturally happen also to maybe fill the same gaps with reinforcements, but even here we don't know, right? We know sometimes troops were interspersed among the units. We know that sometimes the I don't know, the auxiliaries were deployed, for example, between one cohortal line and another. So the combinations really here are as many as the situations that they had to cope with. And in spite we don't know the usual cohortal array, the objection according to which the enemy could have wedged into the gaps is completely inconsistent, right? This is an idea that in popular culture has been developed to mechanistically explain how the Roman legions defeated the Macedonian phalanx. The people had no clue. They had to say basically the objective was opening a gap or getting, the legionnaires getting in the gaps between the manipular units. That of course as gaps existed, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the cohesiveness of the formation. If anything like that happened to the phalanx, it's because like an entire chunk of phalanx had collapsed, and therefore you had this major gap that could enter with big units and making a freaking mess. In every deployment, there is a gap between the units, and that is not exploited, because in order to do that, that is smaller than an enemy unit, and if the enemy wants to get into it, it loses its cohesion, right? And a unit, as we've seen, functions because it has that specific width and depth and composition. It doesn't make sense to lose that formation, its mechanism, what makes it a collectively qualitative unit, to bottle themselves with individual troops into gaps of a formation by which you would easily get slaughtered, right? Doesn't make any sense, right? And you don't even need to quote, I don't know, Livy 30:33 or Frontinus, but it's the Stratagemata 2:3:14 about, I don't know, it's about the Battle of Zama, right? The fact that that Hannibal's elephant had been, how do you say in English, tricked to, however, into these corridors between the Roman maniples, right? Attracted by, the skirmishers, the moats sent the elephants to these prearranged corridors from which the elephants simply, would ran into while the Roman legionnaires tempested them with darts, right? The elephants, by the way, go straight by themselves because they are all in a row, and they file, and they follow actually the female in heat. If you wonder how elephant charges were actually carried out, it's all males following in a trail the female in heat, literally. And that is just, first of all, those are animals, right? So it's not units of men. It's just a file of pachyderms. But with men, it's even worse. Like it doesn't make any sense to think to exploit that gap, right? It doesn't work. You get yourself, even just from a moral point of view, but with which hope to get out of there, would you do anything like that? What matters is how hard you can impact the enemy front line, because if the enemy front line collapses, an entire unit freaking collapses. So you can exploit that serious gap at that point to pour in mass and to make a lot of, and that usually produces pretty, at that point, if that does happen, it's because the entire line becomes wear and collapse in a short while, right? So that's how it normally happens. But the idea that any gap would be exploitable by the enemy at that point is ridiculous, right? Even if, and especially if I would say, if this was also an alternated array with that could easily also move these units in between. I mean, that simply you don't get into, because it's danger zone, right? You don't do it, right? You want to really punch this thing straight and to cause a collapse to the line. That's how you use tactics. If you wedge yourself into those gaps, you basically give up your cohesion, you're done for, right? So that has absolutely nothing to do with military history. Would this gap be used to, favor the rapid employment and eventually even retreat of cavalry? Where corridors did exist for such things, I wouldn't say it's just properly the cohortal system that allows them, more or less. Generally, consider that cohortal in legionary cavalry at this point is just like 120 men, which is just not a punching thing like cavalry in in this context that wasn't even, the decisive arm, but 120 men in front of thousands of infantry, like it's, cavalry in front of thousands of infantry, it's just, just for connection, linking between the various units, messaging, things like that. Yes, there was some tactical function at the end of the day, in the pursuit or something like that, but let's say you don't need as massive movements. There would be larger, usually auxiliary units employed like that on the wings, sometimes even in the front, right? It was a bit, but it's not much of an internal thing of the Legion, at least some sources can even state that prescriptionally, like and ideally, but once again, we don't have evidence for that. I don't know, from Caesar, for example, from somebody who really exposed on a consistent basis, the practical maneuvers would be carried out. Indeed, however, there was a lot of interaction between cavalry and infantry. Like if you read the Commentario del Bello Gallico, it's full of that. Right, cavalry had an important function. It's just we're not informed about the spaces of interaction, sometimes even the ratio of troops, like numerically. So it's really speculative. And in any case, we don't have the specific example of cavalries exploiting tunnels into the formation. No. However, let's say, as we were saying before, it was kind of unavoidable that a unit in column would be speedier than one deployed in line, right? It would move also more effectively, indeed. The cohorts, because of their professional nature, both as even pre-modern times, usually they could have a veteran experience, let's say, and being capable of having enough collective training and experience of years and years of campaign to carry out those complex maneuvers, let's say. But tendentially, the cohortal legion was much quicker at deploying. They had much more experience and readiness for it. Then we don't know how they actually passed from column to line in terms of how the various units interacted, in that sense, how they redeployed. Unfortunately, we don't know. There is no way to reconstruct this position, for example, of the various contubernia within the century, right? You know that a century was made up of 10 contubernia, right? So there were 8 men making up a contubernium. These were the comrades that shared the same tent, and so they were called contubernales, and they were rewarded and punished together. So there was a very strong bond between these men. And it would seem logical, even though we don't know, that the contubernia were individually deployed in column, with the decane in the first rank, right? Both to, in order both to dispose in the first rank of all the best men of the century, both because in this way every fighter would have had at his back a man of his own contubernium. So somebody could rely on heavily in combat. These are two very important principles in the logic of ancient warfare. Not only in this way, a century could have had an initial front of 10 men with a depth of 8. So you had the 80 men per century, with the possibility to, however, double the extension of the front by halvening the depth, right? And we don't know how, but for example, as we were saying before, you could simply pass ahead at the flank of the columns the last 4 men of each column, right? And a logic of this type appears both in, for example, the older the arrays of hoplitic type in Greece, both in the Roman army described by the Strategicon 6 centuries later. And it allows, furthermore, speedy deployment in the passage from the march asset with which the contubernia followed one another in the order, with the men in file per 2 or per 4 to the battle deployment. The battle position of the Centurion, as we were saying, was in the first line on the right of the unit. We know this from Polybius 6:24. It was a very risky position, also in virtue of the particular visibility of his figure, and in fact the percentage of losses of the Centurion was always rather high. Check Caesar Gallic War 225, but it's pretty much unknown. All Caesar's works are basically referring to that. Here we don't need to expand on the figure of the Centurion. We will make a video at some point, but also the banner visibility. I mean, this is normal. Like all NCOs, every leader that fought for front line had both to be visible and to be in front line. So there was no other way around, and that's why Centurions were so selected in that sense. Because, I mean, before the end of the 19th century, any weapon was used was not enough to reduce the advantage that having a commander in the front line with also with a crest, with an appearance, it would be frightful, would be eliminated as an advantage. So it had to be so. The same was for the enemies of the Romans, and it was fundamental for them to be in the first line to assess the situation and to act upon it and to protect the same unit. Your Centurions sacrificed themselves to save their unit's retreat and all this stuff, and it was a radically violent competition to become actually Centurion because of naturally of the rewards, etc. And exactly in this 1st century BC, it's under Caesar times, it's the Centurions start becoming in turn professional figures themselves, because before it wasn't like that. Centurions were remade every time the army was levied originally, so that it had created also problems because there were many veteran Centurions who were sometimes re-enlisted among common troops and had to start the career over again. Instead, now they began to be properly a point of reference in the army, also for their specific professional role and prospects of career, etc. The Signifer, we made a video recently on Roman musical instrument and their players, had in theory the task to guide the attack by being followed by the men of his own unit, but at the same time it couldn't be too exposed in order not to risk the ensign. And also, so there are many episodes. There are famously enough jumps off the boat when landing in Britain that is followed by the unit and gives the confidence to all the legionnaires to follow him, while the Britons were bombarding them with javelins and all this stuff. And so the signum, as we've seen, had a dramatically, it was the ensigns were literally where the imperium resided. So they were clamorously devastating in terms of psychological effect for any legionnaire. They would rather die than losing them, and they would be disgraced otherwise. At least, especially the professional ones, those who went there for the career. During the Civil Wars, there were a lot of conscripts that didn't want to, but the Marian Reform had opened the army to a great mass of people that saw a dramatic advantage of social promotion by being a soldier, right? So these men eventually were, let's say, literally uplifted by this symbolism. They were, the Roman legionnaire was, I can't find an adjective to describe the sheer amount of violence and psychophysical abuse that would create a Roman legionnaire. Because if one speaks of that, starts feeling pretty upset in the sense that these men were basically indoctrinated to believe that the world belonged to them and that everything that stood between them in it would have to be exterminated in the blink of an eye, right? And that you need to literally decompose and recompose a human mind in order to achieve that. And the sheer brutality of Roman discipline and training, it's something that surpassed even same combat experience, and it's something that, I mean, fortunately we can't really think, right, in terms of the it's difficult even to make comparisons with the modern world, because there is simply a different mental background from which these people came from, that made, in a certain sense, violence more natural, but also framed into a specific set of moral values that are completely lost now. Like, you can't properly know what was in the head of a Roman legionnaire or a Germanic warrior, because those things were tied to beliefs that today we don't even know they existed, right? So, and we try to maybe discuss here and there in Schwerpunkt to give an idea, but without that you can't properly understand what this military machine was about. Because if the pride, the blind faith, the obsession, the cult of war, of glory, of legitimation, true victory is something that we have completely cancelled from our mind, morally speaking. In the ancient world, this is what any people believed, and it was shared at every level by these cultures. So it's a completely different background. Let's say that also the signifer, naturally for carrying the symbol of the empire, constituted a privileged target by the enemy, right? Given that in antiquity the value of victory in this sense was even more punching in terms of trophies captured to the enemy, and especially the melee started around the ensigns, exactly because of their conquest. Because once you stripped the enemy of them, at that point you caused a mental trauma that either these men responded with like getting literally themselves killed, or they would flee and be completely in despair, right? So that's what they would always try to do. And in order to cope with this eventuality, there were certain chosen men among the best, the so-called Antisegnani, so those that were deployed antesigna, that is, in front of the ensigns. Look at, for example, Caesar's Civil War 143, 44, 57, right? That would be deployed in front of the ensigns with the specific task to protect them. This is also quoted by Vegetis 2:15, if I'm not wrong. And the concept of the Antesignanus is fascinating because sometimes people confuse it with a kind of lighter troops, sometimes not properly even equipped as the rest of the legionnaires. The question here is that we don't know, and that the term is flexible like all ancient ones, but the point is that these men were properly legionnaires, right? They were sometimes used as a vanguard, right? They weren't literally guys jumping around like, the velitas as skirmishers in the front of the line. They were literally the troops that were, this is how the Latin term conceptually visualizes it, those that are simply in front of the signia. So they can't be literally another unit. And it doesn't specify a typology of trooper / fighter or equipment or whatever, right? So this would be very important because it's obvious that you don't expose such a precious device like the ensign when you know that the enemy is coming straight at it. You try to create some sort of vanguard or something, and this is normal even for any other kind of unit. Like, there is normally always somebody that acts as a vanguard, and that in this case is identified actually as a chosen trooper, as an elite, right? They had to fight in the first ranks, right? But also they could be committed for particularly demanding tasks. So this figure is to be a bit reevaluated, because the Roman legionnaire also was basically trained to fight with any kind of equipment in any kind of situation. So it could happen that in order to travel faster, of course, they would have less gear with them, including even less armor, right? The Roman legionnaire is a heavy infantryman, but occasionally can also operate as a light infantryman, literally. So yes, this could be, let's say, not specifically the Antisegnani, but other legionary troops who could also fight as skirmishers without metal armor, like, and carrying out certain tasks that are not so typical. This is important because at the end of the day, the legionnaire is mostly an assault infantryman, a sort of sort of proto-assault engineer in the history, in the annals of military history, and can adapt, right? Many times, when you have to fight, for example, under fire to build a fortification, well, you can't be properly equipped for work, for combat, but also you have to protect yourself. So there were many ways even the equipment would adapt for the specific tasks, especially also when, I don't know, you also had to evaluate your resources of manpower. I mean, think about Caesar in Gaul, that strived to have more legionnaires, so you couldn't really, waste them strategically. In the Scenic calculation, in certain cases, you would, make even some of them die in order to achieve some greater political strategic result. But in other situations, you actually, most of the times, the legionnaires were not thrown away like that, and therefore you had to also to calibrate their number for specific tasks, and in the absence also of other manpower, and you have to balance the two things out. So some scholars hypothesize that the signifer was located at the center of the unit proper, in third or fourth rank. But in any case, it couldn't be too distant from his own Centurion, given that he had to receive the command to transmit through the movement of the insignia. So it's probably not, at least it didn't happen all the time, and the insignia had to be visible, and they had to be visible to everybody, especially the guys who were in the front, because what do you do? Do you turn that just to see? Well, yes, it can happen sometimes, but still it's better to be, yes, in a safe enough position, but still a pretty visible one by the whole unit when it's focused on the enemy. So in order to have an idea of the position of the signifer, we can consider that in the Battle of Ruspina, in order not to disperse the lines, Caesar ordered that nobody had to proceed ahead of the insignia for more than 4 feet. That is, say, 1.2 meters. It is definitely not much. So that's a very specific requirement. That is to say, basically, you didn't have to abandon the lines, because 1.2 meters is just like, if a guy in front of you attacks you and smashes into you and you have to fight back, you're not calculating too much, tens of centimeters. That's a very strict measure. In fact, in a condition of emergency, say, do not go after them if they attack you, because it would be normal. And the Roman legionnaire, as we've seen, would even try instinctively to do something like that as an individual combatant, and given also what basically his entire armament made him like. This episode is quoted from the African War 15. So also the Korniken, so the horn player, or the player of any other wind instrument, had to find in the immediate proximity of his superior for the same reasons, right? It was crucial that at the moment the Centurion issued the order, the ensign would move, the instruments would sound those specific signals, and it was crucial. Like this was all a multisensorial experience. Even if you look at how the design of helmets and the opening for the ears evolved, that makes you understand that the soldier listening to these orders and looking at what was going on was crucial in this situation, because literally the whole collective effectiveness of the formation was based on this simultaneous work, and that's what the Romans were trained for decades to do in the most horrifyingly brutal way. So that's all their deal, right? Concerning the Optium, so this other NCO, as commander of the rear guard, he had to find himself necessarily in the back of the unit to control the lining, in order to block also certain eventual tendencies to the breaking of the formation. These guys were pretty, heavy, beefy, let's say. They would have this physical strength to push against the soldiers who would gradually, kind of to go backwards under enemy pressure. He also would punish physically with his stick, with a globe at the top. Like if soldiers talked, he would bang that thing on their helmets. It was a very violent thing, right? Very physical and violent thing. It was a fundamental work to one of the Optio to maintain the compactness, the cohesion of the century, especially in the most critical moments. As we've seen, some example before we quoted from the Gallic Wars are quite eloquent. There is another element to observe. This is quite important, especially Vegetsus underlines it with force in 126. Is that the formation of a unit had to be maintained cohese at every cost. Right? It didn't have to be modified in the course of the battle. In case of necessity, the unit had to be simply substituted. Right, while if it had been necessary to enact some maneuver or, let's say, a particular formation, let's say, it was preferable to recur to chosen troops kept in reserve. The light auxiliary infantry, so we're talking about archers, slingers, javeliners, were generally deployed on the wings, or in the center, in front of the first lines. There are examples from Caesar. I know archers in the front, cavalry on the wings. In function, naturally, of an established plan with the purpose of beginning the battle and eventually supporting the legions. Right. So these units were mostly actually fighting against their equivalents from the other side, and they, however, would hopefully compensate for them, right? Otherwise, naturally, the purpose was to exhaust a bit the enemy, to frustrate the enemy formation, to soften it up before, to make it more nervous, more heated, and tired. But for that, normally there was a relative symmetry for which, heavy infantry versus heavy infantry, light infantry against light infantry, and so on. And on different occasions, archers and javeliners were echelons in the intervals among the cohorts, as we've seen, and sometimes they were even incorporated within the same centuries, such as Scipio Aemilianus did at Numantia. This is told by Frontinus Stratagemata 4:7, and Metellus in Africa. This is instead from Sallustius, the Jugurthine War 49. Frontinus says literally, Scipio Aemilianus ad Numantiam omnibus non cohortibus tantum sed centuris Sagittarios et funditores interposuit. So he literally states that he interspersed the archers and the slingers among the centuries, not even just the cohorts. Consider that Frontinus, like, just for saying the matters of history, he ignored historically the existence of manipular legion. Right? And that's okay. This has nothing to do with the quote, but to make you understand also what, like, we quoted him today often, but he is just a person that didn't even know that. So you have to be careful when you read third-hand sources, let's say, because Sallustius instead says, ibi commutatis ordinibus in dextro latere, quod proximum hostis erat, triplicibus subsidis aciam instruxit, inter manipulus funditores et sagittarios dispertit, equitatum omnem in cornibus locat ac pauca pro tempore milites ortatus aciam sicut instruxerat, transversis principiis in planum deducit. So here you have literally the expression. Here we are in the Numidian War. So in theory, the Marian reform is exactly happening now. So he says that there was the dispersion of slingers and archers among the maniples, right? So this practice of dispersing light infantry, missile in this case, among the units is pretty old. It was done very often because these guys do not fight in a formation. They're literally scattered around, and it's obvious that before the battle these guys aren't in the front. They're best used like that because they form a screen that preserves the more the more expansive troops, right? They are more expandable, their own, even if there were also properly elite units in that sense, marksmen in a sense. And cavalry was, as we've seen here also, was traditionally deployed on the wings. It was committed to carry out small, quick incursions, and especially to carry out the pursuit, right? So, but these were, let's say, lighter troops that were, in a sense, employed to support, right? Cavalry was naturally important because when you're outflanked here, there is, you're usually broken, right? But sometimes you can cope with that, as we've seen. You send a detachment to preserve the flanks, to have a bit more of capacity to withstand cavalry, because cavalry is not a decisive arm, right? But tendentially, do not underestimate in this regard always the presence of cavalry in Roman armies, because they existed in consistent numbers, right? And the fact that the Romans themselves, especially at this point, had virtually no cavalry on their own, meaning that they had deputed it to the auxiliaries, doesn't mean that, in fact, Roman armies at the world didn't have cavalry in consistent numbers. They still had, right? Traditionally, until Polybian times, Manipular Legion, the Italics, had very large bodies of cavalry. Then eventually, these guys were Romanized, and eventually they would be the ones here, that would be the filing rank troops of when the full citizenship was extended to them. But so they would join as properly as infantry, of overwhelmingly in number, but they still fought next to important numbers of specialized troops that were constantly integrated. We'll see it better in some other videos. So yes, mostly cavalry, but also this accompaniment, the support troops in the form of missiles especially, was particularly important, and yet not decisive, as you can understand. The heavy infantry made here the greatest part of the work, right? Just you can't pin it down sometimes, and to think about Carrhae, right? Whereas where you have Gallic cavalry is ambushed by the Parthians, so the Romans basically remain without cavalry, because those are cut down, and then eventually the same Romans are pinned down. They manage to repel some Parthian charges, but without cavalry, and they're actually in their condition themselves, because they are exhausted, and the terrain is whatever, but they are defeated by this ridiculously inferior number of cataphracts and horse archers. Also, the Parthians, Surena knew that. He had brought this loads of arrows with to simply shower the Romans with arrows and to basically prevent them to come back across the river. And this is that's a good example of how you can't knock out an army independently from what is it's composed by. It is to say, there's no such thing like an undefeatable army. Like, it's funny when people quote these examples to prove things such as, and I don't know, the Roman legions after all weren't that much, right? Or that other peoples were hyper, that if you look at the broad spectrum of the Roman military history, you realize that things balance out pretty damn well, and then the Romans have the upper hand most of the times. Also, and obviously because they made such extensive use also of auxiliaries themselves, right? But the bulk of the formation was composed by what could be very difficultly overwhelmable, let's say, in terms of properly how do you get rid of this chunk of heavy infantry. There was not much way out, and most of military history was like that. Even during the Middle Ages, cavalry is decisive just for like a couple of centuries, scarcely. For the rest, infantry remains still left. So even if in different proportions from the ancient world, right? Also, well, here it should have a lot of further considerations of the types of enemies, the different political and social entities we're talking about. Because as we've seen even with Arrian, the array against the Alans was very, very specific in order to cope with those tactics. And the Alans are a bit, the forefathers of, at least technically wise, of medieval knight in idea. So that there is really always a lot to discuss. I never had problems to ramble on these topics for a long time, but we will hopefully look at all these things in specific detail with dedicated videos. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.